Hi, and welcome to Itsy Bitsy Bit Bits. Today I'm going to read to you from Falling for You by Libby Kay. Chapter 1. CeCe LaRue was wrist deep in a mound of bread dough when she heard her cell phone ring. The trilling sound grated like a block of aged parmesan over a bowl of pasta. Mumbling a few choice profanities, she lifted her hands and attempted to answer with her elbow as Max's smiling face beamed from the taunting device. After one more attempt at elbow poking, the phone went silent. "Come on," she groaned, knowing the reason her boss called. "He's calling off again, isn't he?" Evan Lawson asked from the doorway. He shrugged off his jacket and dusted a few snowflakes from his blonde curls. Walking over to the table, he picked up her phone as Max called again. "Hey, Max," he answered, watching CeCe roll her eyes from her spot at the table. She tried to push her hair back with her forearm and ended up covering her nose in flour. "Yep, it looks like sourdough this time." CeCe could hear both men laugh at her morning routine. It wasn't her fault she wanted the diner to have fresh bread every morning. "Put him on speaker," she ordered while thrusting her hands back into the blob of dough. Evan shook his head and ignored her request. "Sure thing. We'll get everything ready to go. See you soon." He disconnected and put her phone back on the table. His blue gaze finally met CeCe's and he smirked. The guy had an unnerving ability to disarm her with just one of his goofy grins. Darn him. Now was not the time to evaluate Evan or his ability to short-circuit her brain. Ever since they went to the Christmas Jubilee together, CeCe was unable to bake her way out of Evan's charms. It was just one night out, one night with a friend she thought she knew, but what she hadn't expected was Evans's dance move. The way he'd filled out that tuxedo, the way he respected her boundaries, yet still made her feel seen, made her feel special. They'd laughed and relaxed like they never had on the clock, and she'd be lying to herself if she thought it was a fluke. Evan was certainly boyfriend material, but she was not about to break her rule. You don't date coworkers, or at least not again. Despite going back to their former routine of workmates, Evan wasn't perturbed. He'd always been a nice guy, but over the last couple of months, she felt a shift between them. He'd linger at the end of shifts, taking care to make sure she was in her car safely before heading out. He'd move her things off the higher shelves, keep everything at her level, because it wasn't easy being the shortest one on the team. Not that she'd given him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered by his charms. Nope, not going to happen. "I could have taken that, you know," she huffed, turning her face down to her work. Slapping the now-formed ball of dough, she smiled as the sour tang hit her nostrils. This was going to be a good batch, she could feel it. Undeterred, Evan walked over to the sink and washed his hands. Within a minute, he donned an apron and started cracking eggs for the breakfast rush. "I know, but watching you fail around entertains me," he said, smiling through his egg cracking. "Ugh," CeCe grumbled, as she formed loaves of bread and covered them in a towel to rise. No matter her mood, she trusted the bread-making process. Life was complicated, but she knew that flour, yeast, water and salt made terrific bread every time. What's his excuse this time? Evan pulled down a few frying pans from above the stove and lined them up by the grill. Without being asked, he grabbed another tray for the fresh loaves and placed it on the counter. CeCe had been trying to reach that before he arrived, but she couldn't find her kickstand. Such were the struggles of being barely 5 feet tall. Does he need an excuse? He's been with Ginny every waking moment since Christmas. There was no malice or accusation in Evan's tone. The guy was a born romantic. Their boss and friend had finally gotten his ex-wife back over the holidays. While it was certainly heartwarming, it threw their usually predictable boss off his game and into the arms of love. Sure, Max was still devoted to the diner, but he'd found the work-life balance he'd been missing for years. In a matter of weeks, he was basically a new man. "No, you're right, he doesn't need an excuse." CeCe wiped her hands on a towel and started icing a tray of warm cinnamon rolls, the cream cheese icing oozing into the cinnamon swirls. Like clockwork, Evan joined her side and leaned in for a closer look. His eyes practically sparkled as she handed him the palette knife. "You can have the rest, but don't eat it near the counter." Evan scoffed, but took the proffered knife. "I'm not a kid. I know not to drool over the customer's food." He took his prize and backed away to the corner. CeCe attempted to ignore the sinful noises he made as he licked the knife clean. Maybe she should invest in some earplugs? Pulling at the collar of her tunic, she tried to cool herself down. "Must be the ovens," she muttered as she ambled into the walk-in fridge for the rest of the breakfast ingredients. As she opened the door with an armful of trays, Evan was there at the ready, reaching out and taking the load without even a grunt, carefully placing everything on the counter. "Thanks," CeCe said, as she handed him the second round of trays. Following a familiar routine, the pair stood side by side and chopped, mixed, and prepared what they needed for breakfast. CeCe used to do this routine with Max, but Evan had been taking more of an interest in cooking recently. Their boss getting struck by Cupid's arrow only accelerated Evan's time to test recipes and sharpen his knife skills. CeCe had been at the diner for nearly 3 years, the longest she'd ever been at one job. She was a few months away from her 30th birthday, and she wasn't too proud to say it got to her. Time never meant much to CeCe, who had travelled around the Midwest finding kitchens where she could use her pastry chef diploma. A stint in Chicago and a stop in Ohio's 3 Cs, and she had somehow found her peace in the small Ohio town of Buckeye Falls. The peace of their morning prep work was interrupted when Helen, their lead waitress, barged in through the back door. "Did you see?" she practically shouted as she ran over to them, the local paper clutched in her meaty hand. Evan hurriedly moved a bowl of eggs as Helen thrust the paper onto the counter, which she followed by slapping her hand over the headline. "What's up?" Evan asked, craning his neck to see what all the fuss was about. Helen was usually more sour than excitable. "He's coming to Buckeye Falls this summer for a food competition. Can you believe our luck? Someone like him coming to Ohio!" Helen exclaimed, her enthusiasm contagious, until CeCe finally saw the he in question. Glancing down at the paper, CeCe felt her hands go clammy as she dropped her whisk. It clattered across the floor and landed next to Evan's sneakered feet, a trail of pancake batter in its wake. Without saying a word, he retrieved it and tossed it in the sink. He pulled another whisk from the utensil holder and tried handing it to her, but she was lost in a slew of emotions. Feeling her throat close, she needed to get out of the kitchen and away from the witnesses because she was either going to faint or puke. Her happy place had been invaded by a black and white image of her past, and she knew she couldn't take it, at least not right now. "CeCe, what's wrong?" Evan asked, stepping closer and resting his hand on her arm. Despite the warmth of his touch, she didn't register the contact, just kept blinking. Her eyes brimmed with unshed emotion, and CeCe was no crier. Helen put her hand to her chest, finally picking up on CeCe's mood. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She grabbed a water bottle, opened it, and handed it to CeCe. She took it, but she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her tongue was heavy, stuck to the roof of her mouth like she'd eaten a peanut butter sandwich. Staring up at her from the grainy front page photo was celebrity chef Eric Watson. Over the last couple of years, he'd moved from his own chain of successful Chicago restaurants to being the biggest star on the Food Network. His TV persona was part Gordon Ramsay and part Jamie Oliver, but with the Midwestern charm only Eric could master. He managed to both school someone in the kitchen and make them weak in the knees. Right now, CeCe was feeling his charms in a very unpleasant way, and she feared she was about to upchuck all over her sourdough. Before he was a celebrity chef, he was the love of CeCe's life. There were too many conflicting emotions roiling through her in that moment: sadness, fear, and most importantly, disgust. Disgust that this man still had the power to make her feel this small. She was past all this Eric drama, wasn't she? "I need some air," she said, forcing her feet to propel her toward the door. Helen and Evan stared after CeCe until the door slammed behind her. Stumbling out into the cool early March morning, She tried to fill her lungs with air, but she knew it was a losing battle. She paced back and forth, limbs shaking, as she stared unseeing at her feet. She heard the door open and knew Evan was behind her. He had the uncanny ability to be near her when she needed someone, but this was not the time. Evan draped a coat over her shoulders and ushered her toward a bench, her feet faltering along the way. She leaned on him until they were seated. "Here," he said, taking her shaking hand in his. He squeezed them, and she felt the strength of his grip, of his presence. "What can I get you? You look terrible." CeCe chuckled, giving him the reaction he'd hoped for. "You always know what to say to make a girl feel special." His hand raised to her face and gently swiped a dusting of flour from her nose. Ordinarily, she would tell Evan to keep his distance. It was a poor little crush, but she didn't have the energy now. "I'll be fine. I'm just a little tired." The lie sounded lame to her own ears, and she fought from rolling her eyes. "Why don't you go home and rest? I know what to do with the bread, and Max will be here before lunch. We've got this." CeCe hadn't taken a day off work in a year, and only then because she got food poisoning at the community centre potluck. A word to the wise: never trust Mrs. Sanders' chicken surprise casserole. Apparently the surprise was E. coli. Taking a deep breath, CeCe got to her feet. "I'm fine, I swear. Why don't you help Helen with the coffee maker? You know she always adds too many grounds." Evan didn't move at first, staring as she struggled to compose herself. She would not cry in front of him. She wouldn't. Squeezing her eyes shut, she tried to picture something happy, something light, like a perfectly whipped meringue in a pavlova. But it was no use. She felt vulnerable right down to her core. The sensation made her skin prickle. "Are you sure you shouldn't go home? CeCe, you work yourself to the bone for this place. The last thing Max wants is for you to faint on the job." Bless Evan for his blind optimism. He took her at her word that she was simply tired, and it tugged at her heartstrings. "If you help Helen with the coffee, then I'll be on my game. Seriously, Evan, I'll be right in." Her voice hitched at the end, a sure sign she was about to snap. Judging from the pat to her arm, he either didn't notice or he trusted her. She'd wager it was trust. He approached the world with an openness and eagerness that CeCe didn't share. If she was a bulldog, then Evan was a golden retriever. Over the years, CeCe wore her gruffness like a badge of honor. It kept her focused and, more importantly, kept her heart protected. Maybe she was a grump, but she bet Evan was just a more positive, sweet person. Too sweet, like the cinnamon rolls she'd just frosted. Of all the things CeCe worried about in her life, and there was a laundry list, seeing her ex again was at the bottom of the list. Eric ran in a different circle, and when she left Chicago, she knew he'd never follow. Living in Buckeye Falls had felt safe and comfortable. She had her life at the diner and had quickly become a member of the community. She helped events and was BFFs with the mayor's wife. CeCe truly was a part of Buckeye Falls, but now her little town had betrayed her, inviting her enemy across state lines. She knew she needed to get herself together and read the article. She needed to know what brought Eric to Ohio and how long he was planning to stay. Standing and stretching, CeCe felt the coat over her shoulders. It was Evan's coat, oversized and smelling faintly of cedar and too much spice, like his cheap body spray. Sniffing the collar, she tried to ignore what the scent did to her insides. She also ignored that he always knew what she needed. Evan was a nice guy, that's all. And besides, right now, CeCe had bigger fish to fry.